This is a neuron. More specifically, it's a myelinated neuron. It consists of the dendrites, cell body, nucleus, axon, myelin sheath, and terminating branches. Here is a rough sketch of how two neurons would line up with each other. The terminating branches of the sending neuron would be in line with the dendrites of the receiving neuron. Now that you know the parts of the neuron, how do they talk to each other?
This fascinating process gets really cool at the top of the axon, where sodium channels and potassium channels line the membrane. The inside of the cell has a negative charge, while the outside holds a positive charge.
The inside of the neuron is able to stay negatively charged because it contains small ions known as potassium ions. Keeping the outside positively charged are sodium ions. Potassium can still be found outside the cell and sodium inside the cell. However, they exist in greater concentrations on only one side of the membrane. When an action potential is triggered, sodium channels at the top of the axon open. This allows for sodium to flood into the cell in a process known as depolarization. This causes the inside of this section of the cell to become positively charged and the outside to become negatively charged. In order to repolarize the cell, sodium channels close and potassium channels open up. Potassium floods out of the cell and returns this section to a negative charge on the inside and positive one on the outside. At the same time, the process is happening all over again in the next section, with sodium flooding into the cell to depolarize the membrane and potassium flooding out of the cell in order to repolarize the membrane. The neuron's membrane also contains sodium-potassium pumps, which use active transport to pump sodium outside the cell and potassium back to the inside of the cell. This returns the axon to its normal concentrations in order to prep it for a new action potential.
As you may remember, this is a myelinated neuron. Myelinated neurons have fatty cells known as myelin sheath wrapped around the axon. Think of the myelin sheath like the insulation of an electrical wire. It speeds up the process of an action potential by blocking sodium and potassium from crossing the neuron's membrane. This allows for that change in membrane potential to travel straight through and keep going until it reaches the terminating branches. One of the terminating branches of the sending neuron lines up with a dendrite of the receiving neuron. Inside of the terminating branches are small sacs called vesicles. These vesicles hold small chemicals known as neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters can either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron. Once an action potential reaches the terminating branches, proteins pull down the vesicles until they reach the membrane of the terminating branch. Here, the membrane of the vesicle fuses with the membrane of the terminating branch. Through exocytosis, neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic gap, where they bind with receptors on the receiving neuron to either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron's action potential. Now you know the basics for how our neurons communicate with each other. Thank you for watching.